The letter arrived without warning, and Elena Whitmore's hands trembled the moment she saw the wax seal pressed into the paper. She had seen that seal only once before, on a document delivered to her husband years ago, and it had never brought good news. Now it sat in her palm again, heavier than paper had any right to be. She broke the seal with a fingernail that had gone rough from years of scrubbing floors that were not her own, and she read the words twice before she believed them. She was invited to dine at the estate of Duke Alaric Sterling, the most feared man in the county, on the coming Saturday evening. Her first instinct was fear. Her second was suspicion. No one like her received an invitation like that, not without a reason hidden somewhere beneath the elegant handwriting. Elena set the letter on the small wooden table in her kitchen, the only table she owned, its surface scarred from years of use, and she stared at it as though it might change its mind and turn back into something ordinary. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters of the small cottage she rented at the edge of town, a cottage far too quiet since her husband Edmund had passed 3 winters ago. She had heard stories about the Duke, the same stories everyone in the county had heard. He was said to be cold, calculating, a man who ruled his estate with a discipline that bordered on cruelty. Servants who displeased him vanished from their posts overnight. Business partners who crossed him found their fortunes mysteriously ruined within a season. Nobles who dared challenge him at the negotiating table often left with far less than they had arrived with. He was not a man people crossed twice, and yet here was his seal, on a letter, addressed to her. Elena thought of Edmund immediately. Her husband had worked for the Sterling estate long ago, before their marriage even, doing something he rarely spoke of in detail. He had once mentioned, late one night by the fireplace, that he had done the Duke a service the man could never publicly acknowledge. She had asked what kind of service, and Edmund had only shaken his head and said some debts were better left unspoken. She never pressed him again. Now, holding this letter, she wondered if this invitation was some delayed echo of whatever debt her husband had spoken of. She showed the letter to her neighbor and closest friend, Margaret, a woman who had helped her through the hardest months after Edmund's passing. Margaret read it standing in Elena's doorway, her eyebrows lifting higher with every line. "You must go," Margaret said immediately. "I have nothing to wear to a duke's table," Elena replied. "I have nothing that would not embarrass either of us." "Then wear what you have with your head held high," Margaret said. "A dinner invitation is not a judgment of your wardrobe. Besides, if the Duke wanted to embarrass you, he would not need an invitation to do it. Men like him do not waste paper on cruelty. They simply act." Elena wanted to believe her friend, but doubt clung to her chest like damp air. Still, refusing an invitation from a man as powerful as Duke Sterling was not something anyone did lightly. A refusal could be seen as an insult, and insults to powerful men rarely ended well for people of Elena's modest station. So she resolved to attend, telling herself it was simply one evening, one dinner, and then her life would return to its quiet rhythm of mending clothes for the wealthier families in town and tending the small garden behind her cottage. The days leading up to Saturday passed slower than any days she could remember. She altered her one good dress, a deep blue gown she had worn to Edmund's funeral, taking in the waist slightly and adding a modest lace trim she had saved from an old handkerchief. She practiced, walking, with her shoulders back, though she felt foolish doing it alone in her small kitchen, with no one to see her but the cat that occasionally wandered in through the window. On Thursday evening, a carriage arrived unannounced outside her cottage. It was not there to collect her, not yet, but a man dressed in the deep green livery of the Sterling household stepped down and knocked politely on her door. Elena opened it with her heart pounding, certain the invitation had been a mistake and someone had finally come to correct it. Instead, the man handed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. He gave a short bow, said nothing beyond confirming her name, and returned to the carriage before she could ask a single question. Elena stood in her doorway holding the parcel until the carriage disappeared down the lane, then carried it inside and set it on her table beside the invitation. She untied the string carefully, half expecting something strange or unsettling inside. Instead, she found a single pair of gloves, simple but finely made, the kind of gloves a woman of modest means might save for years to afford. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to indicate who had sent them or why. She turned them over in her hands, searching for some hidden message stitched into the fabric, but found nothing beyond fine craftsmanship. Margaret, who had come by that evening to help with final adjustments to the blue dress, examined the gloves with open curiosity. "Someone wants you to arrive looking respectable," Margaret said. "That is not the act of a man planning to humiliate you." "Or it is exactly the act of a man setting a trap," Elena replied. "Perhaps he wants me comfortable before he embarrasses me in front of everyone." Margaret set the gloves down and took Elena's hands in her own. "You are allowing fear to write a story that has not happened yet. Whatever this is, you will walk in there with dignity, and dignity is something no one can take from you, not even a duke." Elena nodded, though the knot in her stomach did not loosen. That night she barely slept, running through every possible reason the Duke might want her at his table. Perhaps it truly was connected to Edmund. Perhaps the Duke wished to settle some debt quietly, away from prying eyes, using a dinner as cover for a private conversation. Perhaps it was nothing at all, a clerical accident that would resolve itself the moment she arrived, and someone realized her name did not belong on any guest list. Saturday arrived gray and windy, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath before something significant happened. Elena dressed carefully, pinning her hair the way she had seen wealthier women wear theirs at church, though without the jewels or ornaments they favored. She pulled on the gloves the Duke's man had delivered, and for a brief moment, standing before the small cracked mirror in her bedroom, she almost looked like she belonged somewhere grand. The carriage came for her precisely at 6 in the evening, a black vehicle trimmed in gold that drew curious stares from her neighbors as it rattled down the narrow lane toward her cottage. Elena stepped outside, aware of every eye watching from behind curtains and half-open doors. Aware that by tomorrow the entire town would know she had been collected by a carriage bearing the sterling crest. The ride to the estate took nearly an hour, and Elena spent every minute of it staring out the window, watching the familiar countryside give way to grander and grander properties, until finally the carriage passed through iron gates taller than any building in her town. The Sterling estate rose ahead of her like something from a story told to frighten children into obedience, its stone walls dark and imposing even in the fading evening light, its windows glowing with candlelight from within. A footman helped her from the carriage, and Elena forced herself to walk toward the entrance with steady steps, though her legs felt as though they belonged to someone else. Inside, the entrance hall alone was larger than her entire cottage, its ceiling painted with scenes she did not have time to study, before she was led onward, deeper into the house, toward the sound of voices and the smell of roasted meat and fine wine. The banquet hall, when she finally reached it, took her breath away in a manner she had not expected. Long tables draped in white cloth stretched the length of the room, set with silver and crystal that caught the light from a dozen chandeliers overhead. Dozens of guests had already gathered, nobles and merchants dressed in fabrics Elena had only ever mended for others, never worn herself. Conversation buzzed through the room in a steady hum, punctuated by occasional laughter that felt sharp and foreign to her ears. A servant checked a list and directed her toward a seat near the head of the table, and Elena's stomach dropped the moment she saw where she had been placed. The chair beside hers, still empty, was reserved for the Duke himself. She must have misheard. She must have been directed to the wrong seat entirely. She looked around for someone to correct the mistake, but the servant had already moved on to guide another guest, and no one else seemed to notice or care that a widow in a modest blue dress had been seated in the most prominent position at the table, beside the very man everyone in the room seemed to both fear and admire. Elena lowered herself into the chair slowly, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the guests nearest her could hear it. She kept her eyes on the silverware in front of her, afraid to look up, afraid that meeting anyone's gaze would somehow confirm that she truly did not belong in this room, at this table, in this seat. Around her, whispers began to spread. She caught fragments of conversation, hushed voices wondering aloud who the woman in blue might be, why she had been seated in a place normally reserved for visiting royalty or the Duke's closest allies. Elena kept her hands folded in her lap, the fine gloves hiding fingers that trembled despite her best efforts to remain composed. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the room fell into an immediate and complete silence. Every guest rose from their seats in a single fluid motion, as though the action had been rehearsed for years. Elena rose as well, a half-second behind everyone else, her eyes finally lifting to see the man every person in this room had been waiting for. Duke Alaric Sterling entered the hall with the kind of presence that needed no announcement. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing that bore no unnecessary ornamentation, his expression unreadable, as he surveyed the room. His eyes were sharp, moving across the gathered guests with the precision of a man cataloging every detail, every face, every possible threat or opportunity the evening might hold. He walked the length of the hall toward the head of the table, nodding occasionally to guests he recognized, offering nothing more than the barest acknowledgement to men who had traveled great distances hoping for his favor. Elena watched him approach, her breath caught somewhere in her chest, certain that the moment he reached his seat and saw her sitting beside it, everything would fall apart. The Duke reached the head of the table and paused. His gaze fell on Elena, and for a moment that stretched far longer than it should have, he simply looked at her, his expression giving away nothing of what he might be thinking. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath alongside her, waiting to see what the most feared man in the county would do when he found a poor widow seated in the place of honor beside him. A steward near the head of the table cleared his throat and stepped forward quickly, his face pale with the particular panic of a man who believes he is about to be blamed for something he did not do. His name was Percival Lang, and he had served the Sterling household for over a decade, long enough to know that mistakes at the Duke's table were rarely forgiven quietly. "Your Grace," Percival said, his voice lower than he intended, meant only for the Duke's ears, though half the table strained to hear. "There has been an error in the seating arrangement. This woman was meant to be placed further down the hall. I will have her moved immediately." He reached toward Elena's chair as though to guide her from it himself, and Elena felt her face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the warmth of the candles around her. She began to rise, ready to accept the correction, with whatever dignity she could manage, ready to disappear quietly, to whatever seat had truly been meant for someone of her standing. "Sit down," the Duke said. The words were not loud, but they carried through the hall with the force of something far greater than volume. Elena froze halfway out of her chair, uncertain whether the command had been meant for her or for the steward hovering anxiously beside them. The Duke's eyes had not left her face. "I said sit down," he repeated, and this time there was no mistaking his intent. Elena lowered herself back into the chair, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone in the room could hear it over the crackling of the candles. Percival Lang's face drained of what little color it had left. "Your Grace, I assure you, the seating chart clearly indicates—" "I know what the seating chart indicates," the Duke said, finally turning his attention away from Elena to face his steward directly. "I wrote it myself, 3 weeks ago. There is no error, Percival. This seat belongs to Mrs. Whitmore, and it has belonged to her since the moment I sent out these invitations." A murmur rippled through the hall, guests exchanging glances, whispers passing from ear to ear faster than any servant could have carried a message. Elena stared at the Duke, utterly bewildered. He had known her name. He had known it before tonight, had placed it deliberately at this table, in this seat, beside his own, and had told no one why. The Duke settled into his chair beside her, unfolding his napkin with the unhurried calm of a man who had just resolved a matter of no real consequence, though the entire room understood that something significant had just occurred. Percival Lang retreated to his position near the wall, his expression a careful mixture of confusion and barely suppressed anxiety, clearly uncertain whether he had just witnessed a mistake corrected or something far stranger unfolding before him. Elena sat rigid in her chair, unable to relax despite the Duke's insistence that she remain. She had expected humiliation tonight, or at the very least confusion, but she had not expected this strange, deliberate claiming of her presence at his side. She stole a glance at him, taking in his profile in the candlelight, searching for some clue as to what game he might be playing, but his expression remained as unreadable as it had been when he first entered the hall. Around them, the meal began. Servants moved through the hall with practiced efficiency, delivering course after course of food finer than anything Elena had tasted in years. She ate carefully, mindful of every movement, terrified of somehow revealing through her table manners that she did not belong among these people. She noticed other guests watching her, some with open curiosity, others with expressions that bordered on hostility, as though her mere presence at this table were a personal insult to the natural order of things. A woman seated across from her, dressed in a gown that likely cost more than Elena earned in a year, leaned forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Forgive me for asking," the woman said, "but I do not believe we have been introduced. You are Mrs. Whitmore, I understand." "Yes," Elena replied carefully. "Elena Whitmore. And what brings you to His Grace's table this evening?" I confess I am simply curious. It is not often that new faces appear at such a distinguished gathering. The question hung in the air, sharp despite its polite phrasing, and Elena felt every eye near her turn in her direction, waiting for her answer. She opened her mouth, uncertain what to say, uncertain how much the Duke wished her to reveal, when his voice cut smoothly through the tension before she could respond. "Mrs. Whitmore is here at my invitation, Lady Prescott," the Duke said, his tone perfectly pleasant, yet somehow closing the conversation entirely. "I trust that answers your curiosity sufficiently." Lady Prescott's smile flickered, but she inclined her head and returned her attention to her plate, though Elena could feel the woman's curious glances continuing throughout the remainder of the course. The Duke did not elaborate further, and Elena found herself both relieved and more confused than ever. He had protected her from an uncomfortable question, yet offered no real explanation of his own, leaving her suspended in a strange limbo of gratitude and bewilderment. As the evening progressed, Elena began to notice something odd about the way the Duke conducted himself. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried a precision that suggested every sentence had been carefully considered before it left his mouth. He listened more than he spoke, his sharp eyes tracking every conversation happening around the table, as though he were gathering information that others did not realize they were giving away. At one point, he turned to her directly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the general noise of the hall. "You are wondering why you are here," he said. It was not a question. Elena considered denying it, considered offering some polite deflection, but something about his directness made pretense feel foolish. "Yes," she admitted. "I have wondered very little else since your invitation arrived." "Your husband was Edmund Whitmore," the Duke said, again not quite a question, though Elena nodded regardless. "He passed 3 winters ago," she said quietly. "I am aware," the Duke replied, and for just a moment, something shifted in his expression, something that might have been regret, or something close to it, though it vanished before Elena could be certain she had seen it at all. "I did not attend his funeral. I should have. Circumstances at the time made it impossible, and I have regretted that absence ever since." Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this admission with everything she had heard about the man beside her, the cold, calculating Duke, whose name alone was enough to silence a room. "You knew my husband well?" "Better than most people knew him," the Duke said, and then, as though sensing he had revealed more than he intended, he turned his attention back to his plate and said nothing further on the subject for the remainder of the course. Elena spent the rest of the meal turning his words over in her mind, searching for meaning in every syllable. Edmund had worked for the Sterling estate, that much she knew, but the extent of his relationship with the Duke had always remained a mystery, one he had taken with him when he passed. Now, sitting beside the very man her husband had once served, she felt closer to an answer than she had in 3 long years, yet somehow further from understanding it than ever. The hall buzzed with conversation around her, servants refilling glasses and clearing plates, musicians in the far corner playing something soft and unobtrusive beneath the general noise. Elena caught glimpses of other guests studying her throughout the meal, their curiosity now mixed with something new, a wary reassessment of a woman who had somehow earned the personal attention of a man none of them dared question. A man seated further down the table, whom Elena would later learn was Lord Barrington, one of the wealthiest and most influential nobles in the county, watched the exchange between Elena and the Duke with narrowed eyes. He leaned toward the guest beside him and murmured something Elena could not hear, though she caught the tone easily enough, the same low, calculating quality she had heard in Lady Prescott's earlier question. Whatever was happening at the head of this table, it was clear that not everyone present found it merely curious. Some found it threatening. Dessert arrived, an elaborate arrangement of pastries and fruit that Elena barely tasted, her attention consumed by the growing sense that something larger than a simple dinner invitation was unfolding around her. The Duke remained largely silent through this course as well, though she noticed him watching the room with increasing intensity, his eyes moving from guest to guest, as though he were building toward some decision he had not yet shared with anyone. Finally, as servants began clearing the dessert plates and the hall settled into the comfortable lull that often preceded the end of a formal dinner, the Duke rose from his seat. The hall quieted immediately, every conversation dying away as guests turned their attention toward the head of the table, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Before this evening concludes," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall, I find myself compelled to make an observation about the arrangement of this table. Percival Lang, standing near the wall, visibly stiffened. Elena felt her own pulse quicken, uncertain what was coming but sensing, from the shift in the Duke's posture and tone, that whatever it was would not be small. I have sat at tables like this one my entire life, the Duke continued, his eyes moving slowly across the assembled guests. I have watched seating arrangements dictated by birth, by wealth, by political alliance, by favors owed and favors expected in return. I have participated in this tradition myself, more times than I care to admit. Tonight, I find I no longer wish to. A ripple of unease moved through the hall. Guests exchanged glances, some confused, others already growing defensive, sensing that whatever the Duke intended might not favor them. Elena remained perfectly still beside him, her heart pounding, wondering if she was about to become the center of whatever storm was building in this grand and glittering room. I intend to reorder this table, the Duke said simply, and I would ask that no one interfere with my reasons for doing so. The silence that followed the Duke's announcement was the kind that seemed to press against the walls of the hall itself, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of candle wax dripping onto silver holders. Elena watched the faces around the table shift through confusion, disbelief, and in some cases, a barely concealed anger that suggested the Duke's words had struck closer to home than she understood. "Your Grace," Percival Lang said carefully, stepping forward again, though this time with far more caution than before. "Perhaps we might discuss this matter privately, after the guests have—" "No," the Duke said simply. "I intend to do this now, in front of everyone, because the point would be lost otherwise." He walked slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the seating arrangement as though it were a puzzle he had only just decided to solve. Elena watched him pass Lady Prescott, who sat up straighter as he approached, her earlier curiosity now replaced with something closer to apprehension. He paused beside a young nobleman near the far end of the table, a man Elena did not recognize, dressed in clothing that spoke of wealth, but carried himself with an air of boredom that suggested he had attended 100 dinners exactly like this one. "Lord Whitfield," the Duke said, "you have sat near the head of my table for 3 years running, ever since your father passed and left you his title. In that time, I do not believe I have heard you speak a single word of substance. You complain about taxes you do not pay yourself. You criticize policies you have never taken the trouble to understand. You will be moving to the far end of the hall this evening." A gasp rippled through nearby guests. Lord Whitfield's face reddened, his mouth opening as though to protest, but something in the Duke's expression silenced him before he could form a single word. He rose stiffly, gathered what dignity he could manage, and made his way toward the seats near the back of the hall. Seats Elena recognized as the ones typically reserved for lesser merchants and minor officials. The Duke continued his slow circuit of the table, and Elena watched with growing astonishment as he began systematically dismantling the careful hierarchy that had governed this room since the moment she had arrived. He stopped beside a middle-aged man in a modest but well-tailored coat, a man Elena had noticed earlier seated far from the head of the table, near the servants' entrance, where the food often arrived cold by the time it reached the plates. "Mr. Foley," the Duke said, and the man startled visibly at hearing his own name spoken by the Duke himself. "You have supplied grain to this estate for 11 years without a single delay, without a single complaint. Even during the difficult harvest, 3 years past, when half the merchants in this county tried to renegotiate their contracts the moment prices rose in their favor. You did not raise your prices on me once, not even when you could have justified it easily. Please, join me nearer the head of the table." Mr. Foley rose slowly, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked very much like tears held carefully in check. He made his way toward the vacant seat left by Lord Whitfield's departure, and Elena caught a glimpse of the quiet dignity in his posture as he sat, a stark contrast to the awkward, uncertain steps of a man unaccustomed to such honor. The Duke moved on, and one by one, he continued his reordering of the table. A young woman who had been serving as a companion to an elderly noblewoman, seated far from the main gathering, was called forward and praised for her patience and kindness, qualities the Duke claimed to have observed during a visit to the noblewoman's estate the previous spring. A retired soldier, seated near the servants' door and largely ignored by the other guests, was moved to a place of honor after the Duke spoke briefly of the man's service during a conflict most of the younger guests barely remembered. With each move, the murmurs in the hall grew louder, more agitated, though no one dared speak directly against the Duke's actions. Elena watched Lord Barrington in particular, his face growing tighter with each reversal of fortune playing out before him, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though physically restraining himself from interrupting. Finally, the Duke arrived at Lord Barrington's seat, and the hall seemed to hold its breath collectively, sensing that this confrontation, unlike the others, might not pass so quietly. "Lord Barrington," the Duke said, his tone carrying none of the warmth he had shown Mr. Foley or the young companion moments before. "You have sat at my right hand for the better part of a decade, second only to family and position at this table. In that time, you have used our friendship to secure contracts you did not earn, to silence rivals through means I have chosen not to inquire too closely into, and to spread rumors about my own household that I have, until now, chosen to ignore for the sake of old loyalties." Lord Barrington's face went white, then red, his composure cracking for the first time that evening. "Your Grace, I do not know what you have heard, but I assure you." "I have heard enough," the Duke said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that silenced Lord Barrington immediately. "You will keep your seat tonight, out of respect for the years we have known each other. But do not mistake my restraint for forgetfulness. I intend to review our arrangements in the coming weeks, and I suggest you use that time wisely." Lord Barrington said nothing further, though the fury in his eyes was unmistakable even from where Elena sat. The Duke turned away from him and continued his circuit, and Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the crowded hall. She had witnessed, in the span of a single evening, the quiet, controlled dismantling of alliances that had likely taken years to build, carried out by a man who apparently felt no need to raise his voice to make his point felt. When the Duke finally returned to his own seat beside Elena, the table had transformed entirely. The careful hierarchy of birth and wealth that had defined the seating chart at the beginning of the evening had been replaced by something far less predictable. A strange and uneven collection of merchants, servants, soldiers, and companions, mixed among the remaining nobility, all of them now sharing space that had once been reserved for those with titles and fortunes alone. "You understand now," the Duke said quietly to Elena, "why your seat was never a mistake." Elena turned to look at him, searching his face for the answer he seemed to expect her to already possess. "I understand that you have made a great many enemies tonight," she said carefully. "I do not yet understand what any of this has to do with me." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the transformed table, before settling back on her. "Your husband once told me that a man's true worth is measured by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. I did not understand what he meant at the time. I was young, arrogant, certain that power and position were the only currencies worth collecting. It took me many years, and several costly mistakes, to understand what he had been trying to teach me." "Edmund said that to you?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said a great many things to me," the Duke replied, "during a time in my life when I trusted almost no one. He was one of the few people who never asked me for anything, never used our association to advance himself, even when I offered him opportunities that would have made him a wealthy man. He simply did his work, honestly and quietly, and he spoke the truth to me when everyone else around me was too afraid or too self-interested to do the same." Elena felt tears gathering behind her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling in front of the watching guests. She had known Edmund as a good man, a kind husband, a quiet presence who never spoke much of his work, but always came home with the same steady gentleness, regardless of what troubles the day had brought. She had not known, until this very moment, the full weight of what he had meant to someone as powerful and guarded as the man now sitting beside her. "There is more," the Duke said, his voice dropping lower still, though the hall around them had begun to fill again with cautious conversation as guests adjusted to their new positions. "More than I can properly explain at a dinner table, surrounded by ears that would carry every word to places I would rather they did not go. I would ask that you remain after the other guests have departed. There is something I believe you deserve to know, something I have carried for longer than I care to admit." Elena's heart pounded at the request, uncertain whether it filled her with relief or a new and different kind of fear. She glanced around the hall, at the reordered table, at the guests still whispering among themselves about the extraordinary events they had just witnessed, and she found herself nodding before she had fully decided to agree. "I will stay," she said. The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly, as though her answer had lifted a weight he had been carrying for a very long time. He said nothing further on the matter, turning instead to greet Mr. Foley, who had been moved to a seat nearby, and now sat looking somewhat overwhelmed by his sudden elevation in status. The Duke spoke to him warmly, asking after his family, his business, the health of his eldest daughter who Elena gathered had been ill the previous winter, and Elena watched this exchange with a strange mixture of emotions she could not fully untangle. This was not the cold, calculating man the county whispered about in fearful tones. Or perhaps he was exactly that man, and also something more complicated. A person capable of both ruthless precision and genuine warmth, depending on who sat across from him and what history connected them. Elena found herself reassessing everything she thought she understood about Duke Alaric Sterling, and she suspected, from the careful way he continued to avoid meeting her eyes for the remainder of the evening, that whatever he intended to tell her once the hall emptied would reshape her understanding of him even further. The remaining courses passed in a blur for Elena, her mind occupied entirely with anticipation of the conversation to come. She noticed Lord Barrington watching her from across the reordered table, his expression unreadable now, though she suspected the calm surface hid a great deal of calculation underneath. She noticed Lady Prescott whispering to a companion, occasionally glancing in her direction, with an expression that had shifted from curious to something closer to wary respect. And she noticed the Duke himself, occasionally glancing at her sideways, as though checking to ensure she had not changed her mind about staying, though he said nothing further to her directly until the final course had been cleared and the guests began, one by one, to take their leave. The great hall emptied slowly, guests departing in small clusters, their carriages rolling away down the long drive one after another, until the sound of hooves and wheels faded into the distance and left the estate wrapped in an unusual quiet. Servants moved through the room, clearing the last of the dishes, their footsteps soft against the polished floor, careful not to disturb the two figures still seated near the head of the long table. The Duke waited until the final servant had withdrawn before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried none of the commanding authority he had used to reorder the table earlier that evening. Instead, he sounded almost tired, the weight of something old and heavy pressing down on his words. 15 years ago, he began. Before I inherited this title, before my father passed and left me with responsibilities I felt entirely unprepared to carry, I made a decision that nearly destroyed everything my family had built over 3 generations. Elena listened carefully, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain where this story would lead, but sensing that interrupting would only delay whatever truth he had promised to share. I was young, and I believed myself far cleverer than I actually was, the Duke continued. I entered into a business arrangement with a group of men who presented themselves as legitimate merchants, but who were, in truth, involved in activities that would have brought ruin upon my family's name, had they ever come to light. I did not know this when I agreed to their terms. I discovered it only after I had already committed a significant portion of the estate's resources to their schemes. What kind of activities? Elena asked quietly. Smuggling, the Duke said, the word landing heavily in the quiet hall. Goods moved across borders without proper documentation, taxes avoided through falsified records, all of it hidden behind the appearance of ordinary trade. I did not participate directly in these deceptions, but my name, my family's resources, had become entangled with theirs in ways that would have been nearly impossible to untangle without significant scandal. Elena felt a chill settle over her, uncertain where this history intersected with her husband, but she remained silent, waiting for the Duke to continue. Your husband worked as a clerk for one of the trading houses I dealt with at the time, the Duke said. A minor position, unremarkable in every way, except that Edmund possessed a quality I had not encountered often among the men surrounding me during that period. He possessed honesty, and more than that, he possessed the courage to act on it, even when doing so put him at considerable personal risk. Edmund never mentioned working for a trading house, Elena said softly. He told me he worked in accounts for the estate, nothing more. He worked for both, at different times, the Duke explained. But it was during his time with the trading house that our paths truly crossed. Edmund discovered the extent of the falsified records, the smuggling operations hidden within legitimate shipments, and he understood immediately the danger this posed, not just to the merchants involved, but to everyone whose name had become associated with their operations, including mine. The Duke paused, his eyes distant, clearly reliving a memory he had carried privately for a very long time. Most men in his position would have said nothing. Speaking up meant risking his own employment, possibly his own safety, given the nature of the men involved. Silence would have been the safer choice, the choice that protected his family, and asked nothing of him beyond looking away from a problem that was not truly his to solve. But he did not stay silent, Elena said, though it was not truly a question. She knew her husband well enough to understand exactly how this story would unfold, even before the Duke confirmed it. He came to me directly, the Duke said. Late one evening, without any prior arrangement, he requested an audience and told me everything he had discovered. He risked his position, his safety, and quite possibly his life, to warn a man he barely knew about a danger that threatened to destroy that man's family name. I have never forgotten the courage that required, nor the trust he placed in me to act honorably once I possessed the truth. Elena's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. She had known Edmund as gentle, quiet, unassuming in nearly every aspect of his life. She had never imagined him capable of the kind of quiet bravery the Duke now described, confronting a powerful young nobleman with dangerous information, risking everything for the sake of doing what was right. "What did you do, once he told you?" she asked. "I acted immediately," the Duke said. "I severed every connection to those merchants within the week, though doing so cost the estate a considerable sum, and required me to rebuild several important business relationships from nothing. It was the most difficult decision I had made in my life up to that point, and it was also the correct one, a fact I understood clearly, only because your husband had given me the information and the courage to act on it before the situation grew any worse." "And the merchants? The men involved in the smuggling?" "Their operations were eventually exposed through other means, unrelated to my involvement, and they faced consequences appropriate to their actions," the Duke said carefully. I ensured, quietly, that Edmund's name was never connected to any of it. He had risked enough already. I owed him at least the protection of his privacy. "Why did he never tell me any of this?" Elena asked, more to herself than to the Duke, though he answered regardless. "Because he did not do it for recognition," the Duke said. "He did it because he believed it was right, and men who act from that kind of conviction rarely feel the need to speak of their actions afterward. I offered him a position within my own household following the incident, a significant advancement from his clerk's role, with a salary that would have secured his family's comfort for years to come." "He never mentioned any such offer," Elena said, surprised. "He declined it," the Duke replied, a faint, almost fond smile touching his mouth for the first time that evening. "He told me he had not warned me in hopes of a reward, and accepting one now would cheapen what he had done. He asked instead for something far smaller, something that surprised me greatly, given the magnitude of what he had risked to protect my family's name." "What did he ask for?"
"He asked that I simply remember," the Duke said.
"He said that someday, perhaps, circumstances might arise where a small kindness on my part could matter a great deal to someone who had no power to demand it, and he asked that I extend that kindness when the moment came, whatever form it might take. I gave him my word, and then, in the years that followed, I largely forgot the promise, buried as I was beneath the endless demands of managing this estate and building the reputation that has followed me ever since." Elena sat quietly, absorbing everything she had just learned, trying to reconcile this new understanding of her husband with the gentle, unassuming man she had shared her life with for over a decade. She had always known him to be good, honest, kind, in small everyday ways, but she had never fully appreciated the depth of conviction that lay beneath that quiet exterior. "I did not remember my promise fully until I learned of his passing," the Duke continued. "By then, 3 years had already gone by, and I felt the shame of having forgotten so completely what he had asked of me. I made inquiries about your circumstances, discreetly, not wishing to intrude upon your grief with the sudden attention of a man you likely did not even remember by name." "I remembered your name," Elena said. "Edmund mentioned it, rarely, but I remembered. I learned that you had managed on your own since his passing," the Duke said, "taking in mending work, living modestly, but without complaint, never once seeking assistance from anyone, despite circumstances that would have justified asking for help many times over. I recognized, watching from a distance, the same quiet strength and dignity that had defined your husband, and I understood that the time had finally come to honor the promise I made him all those years ago. By inviting me to dinner? Elena asked, still working to piece together how this elaborate evening connected to a promise made so long ago. By inviting you to dinner, the Duke confirmed, and by seating you where I did, deliberately, so that everyone in this county would understand, without my needing to explain it in detail, that Elena Whitmore is a woman deserving of honor and respect, regardless of the modesty of her circumstances. Word travels quickly among these people. By morning, every noble family in the region will know that I hold you in the highest esteem, and that esteem will follow you into every interaction you have with them from this point forward. Elena stared at him, beginning to understand the true scope of what had unfolded that evening, far beyond a simple dinner invitation or a quiet private conversation. The Duke had used his own reputation, his own considerable influence, to shield her from the kind of quiet disrespect and dismissal that often followed widows of modest means, ensuring instead that she would be treated with the deference typically reserved for those of far higher standing. "This is a great deal to offer someone you barely know," Elena said softly. "I did not do this for a stranger," the Duke replied. "I did this for the widow of a man who saved my family's name and asked for nothing in return but a promise I very nearly failed to keep. Consider tonight the beginning of repaying a debt I should have addressed years ago, not the whole of it." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavy with implication. "You speak as though there is more to come." "There is," the Duke said, rising from his chair and moving toward the tall windows overlooking the dark grounds beyond. "But before I explain further, you should understand that not everyone in this county will welcome what I intend to do next. Lord Barrington, in particular, has reasons of his own to fear the changes I have already set in motion, reasons that extend well beyond his wounded pride at losing his seat beside me this evening." Elena felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her at the mention of Lord Barrington, recalling the barely restrained fury she had witnessed in his eyes when the Duke publicly stripped him of his position at the table. "What reasons does he have to fear you, beyond tonight's embarrassment?" The Duke remained facing the window, his reflection faint against the dark glass, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained some of the careful precision she had noticed earlier in the evening. "Lord Barrington has spent the better part of a decade quietly acquiring debts owed by smaller landholders throughout this county, buying up their obligations from failing creditors at reduced prices, then calling in those debts at moments calculated to cause the greatest possible hardship. Families have lost land, homes, and livelihoods to his patient, methodical accumulation of power, and he has done it all while maintaining the appearance of a respected and generous neighbor." "And you knew this before tonight?" Elena asked. "I suspected it for some time," the Duke admitted, turning finally to face her again. "But suspicion is not proof, and Lord Barrington has been careful, always operating through intermediaries, always ensuring that his own name appeared nowhere on the documents that ruined the families he targeted. I lacked the evidence necessary to confront him directly, and confronting a man of his standing without proof would have accomplished nothing beyond alerting him to cover his tracks more carefully." "What changed tonight?" Elena asked. "Nothing changed regarding the evidence," the Duke said. "But something changed regarding my patience, watching him sit at my table for years, accepting my hospitality, while quietly destroying families throughout this county. I found I could no longer stomach the pretense of friendship between us. Tonight was the first step in a longer process, a signal to him and to everyone watching that his position is no longer as secure as he has come to believe." Elena considered this, turning the implications over carefully in her mind. "You have made a dangerous enemy tonight, over a matter that has nothing directly to do with me." "Perhaps," the Duke acknowledged, "though I would argue it has everything to do with you, and with everyone else in this county who has been quietly overlooked or exploited by men who mistake wealth and title for permission to treat others carelessly. Your husband taught me, long ago, that true strength lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. I have failed to live up to that lesson, more often than I would like to admit over the years. Tonight, I intend to begin correcting that failure." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Percival Lang entered the hall carrying a small silver tray with 2 cups of tea, his expression still carrying traces of the confusion that had gripped him throughout the evening's unexpected events. He set the tray down carefully near Elena and the Duke, bowed slightly, and withdrew without a word, while Elena noticed him glancing back once before the door closed behind him. "Your steward seems troubled," Elena observed. Percival has served this household faithfully for 11 years, the Duke said, settling back into his chair. He is unaccustomed to seeing me act outside the careful, calculated patterns I have followed for most of my adult life. Tonight has likely unsettled him more than he would ever admit aloud. It has unsettled a great many people tonight, Elena said, thinking of the whispers and glances she had witnessed throughout the evening, the careful, calculating expressions on the faces of guests who had watched their carefully ordered world rearranged in the span of a single meal. Change often unsettles people, the Duke replied, particularly those who have benefited from things remaining exactly as they were. I do not expect gratitude from Lord Barrington, or from those who share his interests. I expect resistance, and likely retaliation of some kind, though I have prepared myself for that possibility as best I can. What kind of retaliation? Elena asked, a note of genuine worry entering her voice, though she was uncertain whether her concern was for the Duke, for herself, or for the strange, unexpected connection that seemed to have formed between them over the course of a single remarkable evening. Men like Barrington rarely act directly, the Duke said. He will not challenge me openly, not without proof that I possess evidence against him, which currently I do not. Instead, he will likely attempt to undermine my position through quieter means, spreading rumors, calling in favors from allies who owe him debts of their own, perhaps even attempting to damage my standing with the crown itself if he believes it would serve his purposes. And what of me? Elena asked quietly. Am I in danger, now that I have been so publicly associated with you? The Duke's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Elena saw something in his eyes that looked genuinely like concern, a crack in the composed, controlled exterior he had maintained throughout most of the evening. I have considered that possibility carefully before extending tonight's invitation. I do not believe Barrington would risk direct action against you, not without significant provocation, as doing so would draw far more attention to his activities than he could afford. However, I would be lying if I told you there was no risk at all in the position I have placed you in tonight. Elena absorbed this admission, aware of the weight it carried. She had walked into this dinner believing herself the recipient of a strange, unexplained honor, and she was walking out of it, hours later, having learned that her late husband had once risked everything to protect this powerful man's family, and that she herself had now become, however unwittingly, a piece in a larger struggle between the Duke and one of the most dangerous men in the county. Why tell me all of this? She asked. You could have simply repaid your debt quietly, offered some financial assistance, and allowed me to return to my life without ever knowing the risks involved. Because you deserve the truth, the Duke said simply. Your husband never hid difficult truths from me, even when doing so would have been easier and safer for him. I owe you the same honesty, particularly given what I intend to ask of you next. Elena's breath caught slightly at his words. What do you intend to ask? The Duke rose again from his chair, this time moving to stand near the long table, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where he had sat throughout the evening's meal. I have decided to establish a formal program of support for widows throughout this county, particularly those whose husbands served this estate in some capacity during their lifetimes, or those who have found themselves without adequate means following the loss of their family's primary providers. I intend to fund this program personally, and I would like your assistance in helping to identify those most in need of such support. Elena blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. You wish for my help? You understand hardship in ways that the clerks and officials I typically rely upon for such matters simply cannot, the Duke explained. You have lived it, navigated it, survived it with a dignity that many people in far more fortunate circumstances fail to manage. I believe your insight would prove invaluable in ensuring that whatever assistance this program provides reaches those who genuinely need it, rather than being diverted or mismanaged by well-meaning but ultimately disconnected administrators. This is a significant responsibility, Elena said slowly, still processing the scope of what he was proposing. It is, the Duke agreed, and I understand if you require time to consider it. This is not a small request, and I recognize that accepting such a role would draw further attention to you, attention that may not always be welcome given the tensions I have already set in motion tonight. Elena thought of Margaret, of the years she had spent mending clothes for wealthier families, quietly grateful for whatever small income it provided while watching other widows throughout the county struggle far more visibly than she ever had. She thought of the women she had heard about through gossip and rumor, left destitute after their husbands' deaths, forced into desperate circumstances that no one of standing seemed inclined to address. "I do not need time to consider it," she said finally. "I will help you, on one condition." The Duke raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting a widow of modest means to negotiate terms with him, though something in his expression suggested he found the development more intriguing than offensive. "And what condition is that?" "That this program addresses real needs, honestly assessed, rather than becoming another tool for you to demonstrate your generosity to the county at large," Elena said, her voice steadier now than it had been for most of the evening. "I have seen how charity can sometimes serve the giver more than the receiver, how it can become a performance rather than genuine assistance. If I am to help you with this, I want assurance that the women we help will be treated with dignity, not as objects of your benevolence to be displayed and discussed at dinners like tonight's." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Elena wondered if she had overstepped, if her boldness would undo whatever fragile understanding had formed between them over the course of the evening. Instead, something that might have been genuine respect flickered across his features. "You have your husband's directness," he said. "He spoke to me in exactly that manner once, when he believed I was pursuing a course of action for the wrong reasons. I gave him my word then that I would consider his counsel seriously, and I give you the same word now. This program will serve the women who need it, quietly and with dignity, not the reputation of the man funding it." Elena felt a small measure of tension leave her shoulders, though the weight of everything else she had learned that evening remained. "Then I will help you, Your Grace." "Alaric," he said, "if we are to work together on a matter of this importance, I would prefer you use my given name, at least when we speak privately." Elena hesitated, the formality of the evening still clinging to her despite everything that had transpired. "Alaric," she said finally, testing the name on her tongue, and something in his expression eased further at hearing it. Their conversation was interrupted a second time, this time by the sound of raised voices outside the hall, followed by the sharp, unmistakable clatter of hurried footsteps approaching the closed doors. Percival Lang burst into the room moments later, his earlier composure completely abandoned, his face pale with alarm. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately drew both Elena and the Duke to their feet. "Lord Barrington has returned. He is demanding to speak with you immediately, and he has brought several of his associates with him. I attempted to explain that you were engaged in private matters, but he insists this cannot wait until morning." The Duke's expression hardened instantly, the warmth that had briefly softened his features during his conversation with Elena disappearing entirely, replaced by the cold, controlled calculation that had made him one of the most feared men in the county. "Show him in," he said. "It seems Lord Barrington wishes to demonstrate exactly how quickly he intends to retaliate." Elena's pulse quickened as she watched the tall doors of the hall swing open once more, revealing Lord Barrington flanked by two men she did not recognize, their expressions carrying the same barely concealed hostility that had radiated from Barrington throughout dinner. Behind them, Percival Lang hovered anxiously, clearly uncertain whether he should remain or withdraw, his eyes darting between the Duke and the unwelcome visitors. "Alaric," Barrington said, dispensing entirely with formal titles, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I trust you understand the position you have placed me in tonight." "I understand precisely the position I have placed you in," the Duke replied evenly, moving to stand beside Elena, rather than retreating behind the table, a small gesture that Elena noted with quiet appreciation. "You sat too long in a place of honor you no longer deserved, and I have simply corrected an oversight that should have been addressed years ago. This is not about seating arrangements, and we both know it," Barrington snapped, his composure cracking further with each word. "You have insulted me in front of every important family in this county, over some sentimental attachment to a dead clerk and his widow." He gestured toward Elena with a dismissive wave that made her blood run cold, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Careful, Barrington," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a register that carried far more danger than volume ever could. "You would do well to remember that the woman you just gestured toward with such contempt is a guest in my home, and I do not take kindly to my guests being spoken of in that manner." Barrington seemed to catch himself, some flicker of self-preservation cutting through his anger, though the hostility in his eyes did not diminish. "My apologies, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, though the words carried no genuine remorse. I meant no disrespect to you personally. My quarrel is entirely with the Duke's judgment this evening. Then state your quarrel plainly, the Duke said, rather than dancing around it with false courtesy that fools no one in this room. Barrington glanced at his two associates, some silent communication passing between them, before he turned his attention back to the Duke, his voice dropping in volume but gaining a sharper edge. You have made accusations tonight, Alaric, about business dealings you claim to have concerns regarding. I would remind you that accusations without proof are dangerous things, particularly when spoken by men of your standing, in front of witnesses who will not soon forget what they heard. I made no accusations tonight, the Duke replied calmly. I moved seats at a dinner table. If you have interpreted that as an accusation, perhaps you should examine why your own conscience leaps so quickly to that conclusion. The remark landed with visible force, and Barrington's jaw tightened, a muscle working furiously beneath his composed exterior. You play a dangerous game, he said quietly. I have allies throughout this county, and beyond it. Allies who would not look kindly upon efforts to undermine my standing without cause. I would advise you to consider carefully before taking any further action against me. Is that a threat, Lord Barrington? The Duke asked, his tone deceptively mild. It is a simple statement of fact, Barrington replied, though the warning in his eyes suggested otherwise. I have spent years building relationships and securing agreements that benefit this county as a whole. I would hate to see those efforts undone by a personal grievance you seem to have developed, seemingly overnight, regarding matters that are entirely legitimate business arrangements. Elena watched this exchange with growing tension, aware that beneath the careful, formal language, something far more dangerous was unfolding between these two powerful men. She thought of the families the Duke had mentioned earlier, the small landholders who had lost everything to Barrington's patient, methodical accumulation of their debts, and she felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. Perhaps, Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, before she had fully decided to speak. You might explain to me directly, Lord Barrington, exactly how many families in this county have found themselves suddenly without homes, after their debts were purchased, and called in at the worst possible moments. The room fell into a stunned silence. Barrington turned to face her fully for the first time, his expression shifting from controlled anger to something closer to genuine surprise, clearly not expecting the widow he had dismissed so casually moments earlier to speak so directly. I do not believe that is any concern of yours, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. On the contrary, Elena replied, drawing on a strength she had not fully realized she possessed until this moment. I have spent the last 3 years managing a household on very limited means, and I know intimately what it feels like to fear the arrival of a debt collector, to wonder whether the next season's harvest, or the next month's mending work, will be enough to keep a roof over one's head. If you have profited from that fear in others, Lord Barrington, then it is very much my concern, and the concern of every person in this county, who might one day find themselves in similarly desperate circumstances. Barrington's associates shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Elena noticed the Duke watching her with an expression she could not entirely interpret, something between surprise and quiet approval, as though he had not expected her to enter this confrontation so directly, but found himself pleased that she had. You know nothing of the complexities involved in managing large debts and business arrangements, Barrington said, though his tone had grown defensive rather than confident. These matters require careful judgment that goes far beyond simple sentiment. I know that a family losing their home is not a complexity to be managed, Elena replied. It is a tragedy to be prevented, if those with the power to prevent it choose to act with any measure of conscience. The silence that followed her words stretched long and uncomfortable, broken finally by the Duke, who stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Elena and Barrington in a manner that felt protective, without being dismissive of her ability to speak for herself. Mrs. Whitmore raises a point I intend to examine closely in the coming weeks, the Duke said. I have already begun making inquiries into certain transactions throughout this county, transactions that I believe may reveal patterns concerning enough to warrant further investigation. Barrington's face drained of color entirely at these words, and for a moment, Elena saw something flicker across his expression that looked very much like genuine fear. You have no authority to investigate my private business dealings, he said, though his voice had lost nearly all of its earlier bravado. I have every authority granted to me by my position and my responsibility to the families living within this county, the Duke replied. If your dealings have been as legitimate as you claim, you have nothing to fear from a closer examination of them. If, however, they have not been legitimate, I would suggest you use whatever time remains before my inquiries conclude to consider how you might begin making amends to those you have harmed. Barrington stared at the Duke for a long, tense moment, clearly calculating his next move, weighing threats against the reality of his exposed position. Finally, he stepped back, gesturing sharply to his associates to follow him toward the door. This is not finished, Alaric, he said, his voice carrying a warning that Elena suspected was only partially bluster. You will regret the enemies you have made tonight. Perhaps, the Duke replied evenly, but I would rather live with the regret of having made powerful enemies than the regret of having remained silent while good people suffered for the sake of preserving comfortable friendships. Good evening, Lord Barrington. Barrington's face twisted with barely contained fury, but he said nothing further, turning sharply and striding from the hall with his associates trailing behind him. Percival Lang hurried after them, presumably to ensure their departure from the estate grounds, leaving Elena and the Duke alone once more in the now quiet hall. Elena released a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline she had not expected to feel that evening. The Duke turned to her, his expression softer now than it had been throughout the entire confrontation. That was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily reckless, he said, though there was no criticism in his tone, only a kind of wondering admiration. Perhaps it was both, Elena replied, still working to steady her breathing. I did not plan to speak. The words simply came, before I had time to consider whether I should hold them back. Your husband would have been proud, the Duke said quietly. That same instinct, to speak truth regardless of the cost, was exactly what drew me to trust him all those years ago. I see now that he chose his wife as carefully as he chose his convictions. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, uncertain how to respond to praise that touched something far deeper than simple courtesy. What happens now? She asked instead, redirecting the conversation toward safer ground. Barrington will not simply accept tonight's events quietly, will he? No, the Duke admitted. He will likely spend the coming days attempting to shore up his defenses, calling in favors from allies, perhaps even attempting to discredit my investigation before it has properly begun. But he has also revealed, through his own panic tonight, that he has far more to hide than I had previously confirmed. That alone is valuable information. And the families he has harmed? Elena asked. What becomes of them, while you investigate at whatever pace is necessary to build a proper case against him? The Duke considered this question carefully, his expression thoughtful. I believe this is precisely where the Widows Support Program you agreed to help me establish could serve a broader purpose than I originally intended. We could quietly begin identifying families affected by Barrington's practices, offering them assistance now, while simultaneously building the case needed to hold him properly accountable for what he has done. Elena nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in this approach even as she recognized the scope of the work it would require. This will not be a small undertaking. No, the Duke agreed, but I suspect, having watched you tonight, that you are exactly the kind of person capable of managing an undertaking of this size, with the care and integrity it deserves. Elena looked at him for a long moment, taking in the transformation the evening had wrought, not just in her understanding of him, but in her understanding of herself. She had arrived at this estate believing herself powerless, a poor widow invited by mistake to a dinner she did not belong at. She was leaving it, hours later, having confronted one of the most dangerous men in the county, and agreed to help reshape how an entire estate cared for its most vulnerable residents. I will need time to consider the practical details, she said finally, but I believe we can accomplish something meaningful together, Alaric. The Duke's expression warmed further at hearing his name spoken again, and for the first time that evening, something that looked genuinely like hope flickered across his carefully composed features. Then let us begin properly tomorrow, he said, once we have both had time to recover from tonight's rather eventful proceedings. The carriage ride home felt entirely different from the journey Elena had made hours earlier that evening. Where she had once stared out the window consumed by anxiety and uncertainty, she now found herself replaying the night's events with a strange, unfamiliar sense of purpose settling over her. The countryside passed by in darkness, familiar landmarks barely visible beneath the pale moonlight, and Elena hardly noticed the passing miles. Her mind occupied entirely with everything she had learned, and everything that now lay ahead of her. Margaret was waiting when the carriage finally pulled up outside the small cottage, having apparently kept watch from her own window through much of the evening, unable to sleep until she knew how the mysterious dinner had unfolded. She rushed out to meet Elena before the carriage had even fully stopped, her face etched with worry that shifted rapidly to astonishment as Elena began recounting the evening's events. "He reordered the entire table?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising with disbelief as they sat together in Elena's small kitchen, a single candle, providing the only light between them. "In front of everyone? And Lord Barrington came to confront him afterward?" "It happened exactly as I have described," Elena said, still feeling slightly dazed by the memory of it all. "I do not think I fully understood, until tonight, how much power one man's decisions can hold over so many lives." "And you agreed to help him with this widow's program?" Margaret asked, studying her friend closely. "Elena, do you understand what you have taken on? This is not simple mending work you can set aside if it becomes too demanding. This involves powerful men, dangerous secrets, and a duke who has just made himself a very public enemy." "I understand exactly what I have taken on," Elena replied, meeting her friend's concerned gaze steadily. "And I have decided that I would rather face the risks involved in doing something meaningful than continue living a smaller life, simply because it feels safer." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression as she recognized the change that had come over her friend during a single remarkable evening. "Edmund would be proud of you," she said finally, echoing words the Duke himself had spoken hours earlier. "That is precisely what the Duke said," Elena replied, a small, tired smile finally breaking through the exhaustion that had settled over her. News of the extraordinary dinner spread through the county, with remarkable speed over the following days. Exactly as the Duke had predicted, Elena found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations whenever she ventured into town for supplies, though the nature of the attention had shifted noticeably from the dismissive indifference she had grown accustomed to as a poor widow. Shopkeepers who had once barely acknowledged her presence now greeted her with careful, deferential courtesy. Neighbors who had never bothered with more than polite nods began stopping to ask after her health, clearly hoping to glean some detail about her sudden and mysterious connection to Duke Sterling. Elena navigated this new attention with the same quiet dignity Margaret had encouraged her to maintain before the dinner ever took place, offering polite but minimal responses to the curious inquiries that followed her wherever she went. She understood, even as the attention made her uncomfortable, that her measured response to it mattered a great deal, that any hint of arrogance or self-importance would undermine the very qualities the Duke had claimed to admire in both her and her late husband. 3 days after the dinner, a messenger arrived at her cottage carrying a formal letter bearing the Sterling seal once more, though this time the contents felt far less mysterious than the initial invitation had been. The Duke requested her presence at the estate the following morning to begin formal discussions regarding the widow's support program, along with a smaller, more personal note, expressing his hope that she had recovered well from the eventful evening, and that Lord Barrington's confrontation had not left her overly troubled. Elena arrived at the estate the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer the anxious, uncertain woman who had first walked through those imposing gates less than a week earlier. She found the Duke waiting for her in a smaller, more intimate study, rather than the grand banquet hall, papers already spread across his desk, evidence of the careful preparation he had clearly undertaken since their conversation. "I have begun compiling records of families throughout the county who may benefit from immediate assistance," the Duke explained, gesturing toward the documents before him. "Several names appear connected to transactions I suspect involve Lord Barrington's activities, though I want your assessment of their circumstances before we proceed with any direct assistance." Elena moved to examine the papers, her earlier nervousness giving way to focused attention as she began reading through the details of each family's situation. Names and circumstances blurred together at first, but gradually, patterns began to emerge. Families who had lost small parcels of land under suspiciously similar circumstances, debts that had been quietly transferred between creditors before being called in at moments calculated to cause maximum hardship, exactly as the Duke had described during their conversation. "This family here," Elena said, pointing to a name partway down one of the lists, "a widow named Constance Aldridge, who had lost her small farm the previous winter. I know of her situation. Her husband passed suddenly from illness, and within months, she found herself facing debts she had no knowledge her husband had accumulated. Debts that seemed to appear from nowhere shortly after his passing. That aligns with the pattern I have been tracing, the Duke said, making a note beside the woman's name. It appears Barrington's associates may deliberately target households immediately following a death in the family, when grieving widows are least equipped to scrutinize unfamiliar financial claims against their estates. Elena felt a fresh surge of anger at this revelation, thinking of how vulnerable she herself had been during those first difficult months after Edmund's passing. How easily she too might have fallen victim to similar predatory practices had circumstances been only slightly different. "We must help her immediately," she said. "Whatever assistance this program can offer, she should be among the first to receive it." "I agree entirely," the Duke replied, "though I would ask that you personally oversee the details of how we approach her. These matters require sensitivity that goes beyond simple financial transactions. Women in her position have often been humiliated by their circumstances already. Any assistance we offer must restore dignity, rather than further emphasizing their vulnerability." Elena nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his approach, understanding intuitively why he had insisted on her involvement in shaping this program from its earliest stages. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into the work with an energy and purpose she had not felt since long before Edmund's passing, visiting families throughout the county, listening carefully to their circumstances, and working alongside the Duke to develop assistance that addressed genuine needs without reducing recipients to objects of pity or charity. The work was not without its difficulties. Some families, proud despite their circumstances, initially refused assistance, wary of accepting help that might come with unspoken expectations or obligations. Elena found that her own experience as a widow of modest means proved invaluable in these situations, allowing her to approach each family not as a representative of the powerful Duke Sterling, but as someone who genuinely understood the particular indignities and fears that accompanied sudden poverty and loss. Meanwhile, whispers continued to circulate throughout the county regarding Lord Barrington's increasingly desperate efforts to shore up his position. Elena heard reports, secondhand through Margaret and other townspeople, of Barrington attempting to call in favors from allies throughout the region, of tense meetings held behind closed doors, of a man growing increasingly aware that the careful empire he had built over years of patient scheming now stood on far less solid ground than he had previously believed. The Duke, for his part, continued his methodical investigation into Barrington's dealings, gathering evidence with the same careful precision Elena had witnessed during their first private conversation. He shared updates with her regularly, seeking her insight on how various pieces of evidence might connect to the families they were now working to assist, and Elena found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate web of business dealings and betrayals that Barrington had woven throughout the county over the better part of a decade. Nearly a month after the dinner that had changed everything, the Duke summoned Elena to the estate once more, his expression carrying a gravity that suggested significant developments had occurred in his investigation. She arrived to find him waiting in the same study where they had begun their work together, though this time, additional documents covered nearly every available surface, evidence of weeks of careful, methodical investigation, finally reaching some kind of culmination. "I believe I now possess sufficient evidence to bring formal charges against Lord Barrington," the Duke said, gesturing toward the accumulated documents before him. "Evidence of falsified debt transfers, coerced sales of property at fraction of their true value, and at least 2 instances where families were driven from their homes through outright deception regarding the true terms of their agreements." "This is what you have been working toward," Elena said, though something in the Duke's expression suggested the matter was more complicated than a simple triumph. "It is," he confirmed, "but formal charges against a man of Barrington's standing will not be a simple matter. He has spent years cultivating relationships with powerful allies, some of whom may attempt to intervene on his behalf once these charges become public. I suspect the coming weeks will prove far more contentious than anything we have faced thus far." Elena felt a familiar knot of apprehension tighten in her chest, though beneath it, she also recognized a steadier resolve than she would have believed herself capable of possessing only a month earlier. "Then we will face whatever comes," she said simply. "The families Barrington has harmed deserve justice, regardless of how difficult achieving it might prove. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine passing across his features, despite the seriousness of the matter at hand. "Your husband would be proud," he said again, though this time the words carried a different weight, an acknowledgement of everything Elena herself had become over the past several weeks, independent of whatever legacy Edmund had left behind. "I hope so," Elena replied quietly, "though I have begun to think that whatever pride he might feel would be as much for the woman I have become since his passing as for anything connected to his own history with you." "Perhaps it is both," the Duke said. "The two are not so easily separated, I think. He shaped the values you carried into that dinner hall a month ago, but you alone have chosen how to act upon them since." The formal charges against Lord Barrington were announced 3 weeks later, delivered through official channels that ensured the accusations could not be dismissed as mere rumor or personal grievance. The Duke had assembled his evidence with meticulous care, presenting documentation of falsified debt transfers, coerced property sales, and deliberate targeting of grieving widows to magistrates whose authority extended well beyond the boundaries of the Sterling estate. Barrington's response, when it came, proved every bit as desperate as the Duke had anticipated. He attempted first to discredit the evidence entirely, claiming the documents had been forged or manipulated by enemies seeking to destroy his reputation. When that defense collapsed under the weight of corroborating testimony from families willing, at last, to speak openly about their experiences, he turned to threats, suggesting that powerful allies would intervene on his behalf and ensure that any charges against him would ultimately fail. Elena watched these developments unfold with a mixture of anxiety and cautious hope, continuing her work with the Widows' Support Program, even as the larger drama surrounding Barrington's downfall played out across the county. She had grown close, during these weeks, to several of the families she had helped, including Constance Aldridge, whose gratitude for the assistance provided had blossomed into a genuine friendship that reminded Elena of the connection she still shared with Margaret after so many years. "They say Barrington may still escape real punishment," Constance mentioned one afternoon, as the two women sat together in Elena's small kitchen, sharing tea while Constance's young son played quietly in the corner. "Men of his standing rarely face true consequences for their actions, regardless of how clear the evidence against them might appear. The Duke has prepared for that possibility," Elena replied, though she carried her own private doubts about how the matter would ultimately resolve. "But you are right that powerful men often find ways to avoid accountability that would ruin anyone with less influence." As it happened, the resolution came, not through the formal charges themselves, but through an unexpected development that neither Elena nor the Duke had fully anticipated. Several of Barrington's own associates, sensing the direction the investigation was heading, and fearing implication in his schemes themselves, began quietly cooperating with the magistrates, providing testimony and documentation that confirmed everything the Duke had already gathered, and revealed additional layers of deception that had previously remained hidden. Faced with mounting evidence and the defection of allies he had once trusted completely, Barrington's position collapsed with remarkable speed. Within 2 months of the formal charges being filed, he had agreed to surrender significant portions of his wealth as restitution to the families he had harmed, relinquished his most prominent social and political positions throughout the county, and retreated from public life entirely, his once formidable reputation reduced to little more than a cautionary tale, whispered among the same nobility who had once courted his favor so eagerly. Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and something close to sorrow upon learning of Barrington's ultimate downfall, aware that even a man who had caused so much genuine harm remained, in the end, simply another flawed human being whose choices had finally caught up with him. She shared this reflection with the Duke during one of their regular meetings, now conducted with the easy familiarity that months of shared purpose had cultivated between them. "You feel sympathy for him?" the Duke asked, genuine curiosity replacing what might once have been surprise at such a sentiment. "Not sympathy for his actions," Elena clarified, "but perhaps sorrow that a man with his resources and influence chose to use them so poorly, when he might have accomplished so much good instead, had he possessed even a fraction of the conscience my husband carried." The Duke considered this for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps that is precisely the difference between men like Barrington and men like your husband," he said finally. "Edmund understood that true power lies not in what one can extract from others, but in what one chooses to give freely, without expectation of return. Barrington never grasped that distinction, and it ultimately proved his undoing. The Widow's Support Program, meanwhile, had grown well beyond its initial modest scope, expanding to assist dozens of families throughout the county, whose circumstances had been quietly overlooked by the traditional structures of charity and assistance that existed before Elena and the Duke began their work together. Elena found herself increasingly recognized throughout the region, not merely as the widow who had once been seated beside the feared Duke Sterling, but as a woman whose own judgment and compassion had helped reshape how vulnerable families throughout the county received support during their most difficult moments. Nearly 6 months after that first extraordinary dinner, the Duke hosted another grand banquet, this one deliberately different in character from the tense, hierarchy-driven gathering that had first brought Elena into his orbit. The seating arrangement this time reflected the values that had emerged from their months of shared work, mixing nobility with merchants, soldiers, and the very widows the support program had assisted, each guest chosen not for their wealth or title, but for the character and contribution they had demonstrated to their community. Elena arrived at this second dinner wearing a new dress, purchased with her own earnings. From the modest salary, the Duke had insisted on paying her for her ongoing work with the support program, though she had chosen a design far simpler than the elaborate gowns favored by most of the county's noble women. She no longer felt the crushing anxiety that had gripped her during her first visit to the estate, replaced instead by a quiet confidence born from months of meaningful work and genuine purpose. The Duke greeted her personally at the entrance to the hall, his expression warm, in a manner that had become increasingly familiar over the months of their collaboration. "You seem far more at ease this evening than you did during our first dinner together," he observed, offering his arm to escort her toward the transformed table. "I am no longer the same woman who arrived here that evening," Elena replied, accepting his arm easily. "That woman feared she did not belong in a room such as this. I have since learned that belonging is not something granted by wealth or title, but something earned through the willingness to act with conviction, regardless of the risks involved." "A lesson your husband would recognize well," the Duke said, guiding her toward the head of the table, where a seat awaited her, no longer a mysterious mistake or a deliberate provocation, but a position she had earned through months of tireless, meaningful work. The evening unfolded with none of the tension that had characterized their first dinner together, guests mingling easily across the boundaries of class and status that the Duke had once so dramatically dismantled. Constance Aldridge sat several seats down the table, her son beside her, both dressed modestly but comfortably, a stark contrast to the desperate circumstances Elena had first found them in months earlier. Mr. Foley, the grain merchant whose loyalty the Duke had recognized during that first fateful dinner, had become a regular presence at Sterling gatherings, his quiet integrity earning him respect throughout the county's business community. As the evening drew toward its close, the Duke rose once more to address his assembled guests, though this time his words carried none of the tension that had accompanied his earlier announcement about reordering the table. 6 months ago," he began, "I made a decision at this very table that many of you found shocking, even offensive. I chose to honor character over status, integrity over wealth, and in doing so, I set in motion changes that have reshaped how this estate cares for the families within its influence." He paused, his eyes finding Elena's across the transformed table, and something passed between them that felt far deeper than simple professional respect. None of these changes would have been possible without the wisdom and courage of one woman, who arrived at my table as an uncertain widow, and has since become one of the most valuable partners I have ever known in the pursuit of genuine justice and compassion throughout this county. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as every eye in the hall turned toward her, though the attention no longer filled her with the crushing anxiety it once might have. She had earned this recognition through months of difficult, meaningful work, and she accepted it now with the quiet dignity that Margaret had once encouraged her to carry into that very first dinner. "To Elena Whitmore," the Duke continued, raising his glass toward her, "whose late husband taught me the true measure of a person's worth many years ago, and whose own example has taught me that lesson again, more powerfully than I ever imagined possible." The assembled guests raised their glasses in response, a chorus of voices echoing the toast throughout the grand hall, and Elena found herself overcome with an emotion she struggled to fully name: gratitude and pride, and something warmer still, a sense that the quiet, careful life she had built with Edmund had, through circumstances neither of them could have anticipated, blossomed into something far larger and more meaningful than either of them had ever imagined possible. As the evening finally drew to its close and guests began their departures, the Duke walked Elena to her waiting carriage himself, a gesture that would have seemed impossibly presumptuous 6 months earlier, but now felt entirely natural, given everything they had built together. "What comes next? For the program and for everything we have accomplished?" Elena asked, as they paused beside the carriage in the cool evening air. "Whatever comes next, I hope you will continue to be part of it," the Duke replied. "This county has changed for the better because of the work we have done together, and I find myself increasingly reluctant to imagine continuing that work without your partnership." Elena smiled, the same quiet, steady expression that had carried her through every difficult moment since Edmund's passing. "Then it seems we have a great deal more work ahead of us," she said. "I would not have it any other way." The carriage pulled away from the grand estate, carrying Elena back toward the small cottage that had once felt like the entirety of her world, though now it felt instead like simply the beginning of something far larger. A life reshaped not by charity or pity, but by the recognition that true worth lies not in wealth or title, but in the courage to act with integrity, regardless of the cost. Behind her, the lights of the Sterling estate glowed warmly against the darkening sky, no longer a symbol of intimidating power and fear, but of the genuine change that could emerge when one person's quiet dignity met another's willingness, at last, to listen. A year after that first extraordinary dinner, the Widows' Support Program had grown into something neither Elena nor the Duke had fully envisioned during their earliest conversations in his quiet study. What began as a modest effort to assist a handful of struggling families had expanded into a structured system recognized throughout the wider region, drawing attention from neighboring estates whose own leaders began quietly inquiring about how they might establish similar programs within their own territories. The burrito was cold. Elena traveled now to nearby counties on occasion, sharing the practical lessons she had learned about identifying genuine need, preserving dignity in the process of offering assistance, and ensuring that charity never became a tool for those providing it to display their own generosity at the expense of those receiving help. She carried with her always the memory of that first anxious carriage ride to the Sterling estate, using it as a reminder of exactly how vulnerable and overlooked a person could feel, even when surrounded by wealth and apparent security. Lord Barrington, stripped of his former influence, had retreated entirely from public life, settling on a small remaining property far from the county's center. His name mentioned now only rarely, and always as a lesson in how quickly power built on deception could collapse once exposed to genuine scrutiny. Elena felt, whenever his name arose in conversation, not triumph, but a quiet, sobering awareness of how differently her own story might have unfolded had she not found the courage to speak plainly when confronted by his hostility that first evening. Constance Aldridge had rebuilt her small farm with the assistance the program provided, her son growing steadily under circumstances far more stable than the desperate uncertainty that had once threatened to consume their small family. She often visited Elena's cottage on quiet afternoons, the two women sharing tea and conversation that had grown, over the months, into a friendship built on shared understanding, rather than the simple transaction of assistance given and received. Mr. Foley's grain business flourished under the Duke's continued patronage, his reputation for honesty drawing new customers throughout the region, who valued the same integrity the Duke had recognized during that first transformative dinner. He occasionally sent small gifts to Elena's cottage, simple tokens of gratitude for the role she had played in ensuring his quiet loyalty had finally received the recognition it deserved, after years of being overlooked in favor of louder, wealthier voices. The Duke himself had changed as well, in ways that Elena noticed gradually over the months of their continued partnership. The cold, calculating reputation that had once defined how the entire county perceived him had softened, not because he had grown weaker or less formidable in his dealings, but because he had learned to balance his considerable strength with a genuine warmth that had likely always existed beneath his carefully guarded exterior, waiting only for the right circumstances to draw it fully into the light. Their partnership deepened over that year, moving gradually from the formal, careful interactions of their earliest meetings toward something that carried the easy comfort of genuine friendship, and eventually, something that both of them recognized privately as considerably more than friendship, though neither rushed to name it too quickly, understanding instinctively that whatever was growing between them deserved patience and care rather than hasty declarations. Margaret, watching this transformation unfold in her closest friend, often teased Elena gently about the increasing frequency of her visits to the Sterling estate, though her teasing always carried genuine warmth and happiness for the life Elena had built for herself in the wake of such unexpected circumstances. "Edmund would want this for you," she said once, during one of their regular evening conversations. "He would want you to find happiness again, not despite his memory, but because of everything he taught you about living with courage and integrity." Elena often thought of those words in the months that followed, finding comfort in the idea that her growing connection with the Duke did not diminish or dishonor the life she had shared with Edmund, but rather represented a continuation of the values he had instilled in her, carried forward into a future neither of them could have anticipated during their quiet years together. On the anniversary of that first remarkable dinner, the Duke invited Elena once more to the Grand Hall, though this time the invitation carried none of the mystery or anxiety that had accompanied the original letter a year earlier. She arrived to find the hall decorated simply but beautifully, a smaller, more intimate gathering than the grand banquets that had marked the beginning of their story, attended only by the closest friends and allies who had supported their work over the preceding 12 months. The Duke greeted her personally, as he always did now, his expression carrying a warmth that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "1 year ago," he said, as they stood together near the head of the transformed table, "a clerk delivered an invitation to a widow's cottage, uncertain whether she would even choose to attend a dinner that must have seemed as strange and unwelcome as it did unexpected. I nearly did not come," Elena admitted, smiling at the memory of her own hesitation, her fear that the invitation represented some cruel joke or misunderstanding, rather than the beginning of everything that had followed. "I am endlessly grateful that you chose otherwise," the Duke said, his voice carrying a sincerity that needed no further embellishment. "That decision changed not only your own life, but the lives of every family this program has since assisted. And it changed my own understanding of what genuine leadership and responsibility truly require." Elena looked around the transformed hall, at the faces of friends who had become as dear to her as family, at the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt not through charity alone, but through purpose and genuine partnership. She thought of Edmund, of the quiet courage he had shown so many years earlier, and of the strange, remarkable path that courage had ultimately carved for her own life, long after his passing. "Thank you for reordering that table a year ago," she said finally, meeting the Duke's steady gaze. "I did not understand it then, but you did not simply rearrange seats that evening. You reordered the entire course of my life, and I suspect, in some measure, your own as well." "Perhaps we reordered it together," the Duke replied, taking her hand gently in his own. "A single decision, however significant, rarely accomplishes such lasting change alone. It required your courage to accept the risk, your wisdom to guide the work that followed, and your steady example to remind an entire county what genuine dignity looks like, regardless of the circumstances one begins with." Outside the grand windows of the Sterling estate, the evening settled into the same peaceful darkness that had marked the conclusion of their very first dinner together, though the world within those walls had transformed entirely over the course of a single remarkable year. What had begun as an act of quiet remembrance, a promise honored long after it might reasonably have been forgotten, had grown into something neither the widow nor the Duke could have anticipated when a simple clerk's letter first arrived at a small, unassuming cottage on the edge of town. It stood now as proof that the smallest acts of integrity, carried quietly through the years, could ultimately reorder not just a single table, but the fortunes of an entire community, one honest choice at a time.